Ahí está, mira. Hola, hola. Vamos a grabar. Vamos a grabar a ver cómo te... Vale, vale. Hola, sí, 1, 2, 3. Hola, hola. Vale. Vamos a ver ahora cómo se escucha. Entra, ¿eh? Sí, oh. Hola, hola. Sí, sí, sí. Este no es. Sí. Sí, hola, hola. Ahí está bien. A ver. Sí. Hola, hola. Bájalo un poco más, a ver.
Hola, hola. Antes de empezar, vamos a hacer un pequeño...
Before starting, I'm just going to test the interpreting with a view to everybody checking and putting on your headset at the lowest volume possible so that everybody can enjoy the conference. Please make sure your volume is not loud. So this is just a trial. This is interpreting. I'm going to say something in English, which are going to just be numbers. And we're going to ask you please to put your headsets on. For those of you that are listening for interpreting into Spanish, please just put it on. You know, don't sort of let it dangle off. Make sure it's close to your head. And turn the volume down until you can hear well, but you're not interfering with your neighbors. So try to keep the volume down. So here, I'll start now.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 19, 20. ¿Vale? Gracias.
Hola. Hola, hola. Yo creo que puede estar.
Thanks for resisting the temptation to nip down to the beach, which is a clear temptation that's there. We should actually perhaps close the curtain so that nobody's tempted this afternoon. But I promise you that we will finish at 5:30 so that you've got enough time to enjoy Santander. This afternoon we've got with us a person who's worked with me over many, many years as Director General of the military staff. The military staff. I don't know how to say it in Spanish. Same thing. The Director General of military staff, although in Brussels. How many officers do you have with you? I have 200. In Brussels, he had 200 officials under his command of all the different European armed forces. So 280 officials in MPCC, which is military planning and conduct capability. Because we don't want at all to say military staff, because that's what people do. They don't like to say military staff, so we call it the MPCC, which is military conduct and capability, military planning, conduct and capability. Admiral Hervé Lejean has served for many years, an excellent professional record in the French Navy. I think he's also commanded helicopters at a time when a ship had been taken by pirates off the coasts of Somalia. He managed to stop the pirates and save the crew. That's not something that you have to do every day, just once in a while. And he's been with us in Brussels, heading up the staff. So you can imagine having 280 officials of all the European armed forces. Just goes to show how Europe is growing in defense. People don't know that. People think that it's just bureaucrats and office workers, but no, there are officers. They are a part of a human team that head up military missions and take charge of defense policy. And an important part of defense policy is to develop and apply the European Peace Fund, which is when we started to equip the armed forces of those countries that we have an arrangement with. Normally, African countries. We never thought we would be having to use it for Ukraine, because we never thought that there would be a war in Europe. But when the fund was created with around 5 billion euros, we actually distributed those monies amongst the different armed forces. Practically all of those armed forces no longer actually work with us. We have Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, but Admiral Bejan has, amongst other things, been in charge of coordinating military aid to Ukraine via this fund, and he knows in depth how, of course, the war has progressed. I read a talk that you gave at the French National Assembly when you had to explain how the war was going. If perhaps you could tell us how you told it them back then. Our students would really be interested in knowing how things in reality. So nobody can do that better than Admiral Blejon, and I'm really, really pleased that he's here, because these are his first few days of holiday after having left active service. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Joseph. I prepared it in English, so I think that would be better for the translation. So as you mentioned, I've been for 3 years Director General of the EU Military Staff and Director of the MPCC, Military Planning and Conduct Capability. As you see, the vocabulary is everything but military, because that vocabulary has been invented while the Brits were still in the EU, and they tried to push back any military operational ambition from the EU at this stage. I can say everything. I'm retired. No one can fire me. So I will not prevent myself on that. Si vis pacem para verbum, I think I will bring you back to the bellum this afternoon very much, talking about Ukraine, the war, and how EU responded to that and organized itself. So it will be tactical. I will try not to be too much technical, but I think it's good that you understand the mechanism that we have implemented. Just to remind you what is the EUMS, the EU Military Staff and the Military Planning and Conduct Capability. I will elaborate more in the session tomorrow, but the EU Military Staff is bringing the military expertise to all the EU institutions. So I was working under the direct authority of the High Representative, working for the External Action Service, but working also for the Council, for the Commission, especially in the capability building area, working with the European Defence Agency and all the other institutions. The Military Planning and Conduct Capability is a young body, decided in 2017, when we decided it would be good not to really have an operational headquarters. It is the embryo of operational headquarters, but to have the mission commander of all the military mission of the EU in Brussels, in order to prevent the force commanders to come every 2 weeks in Brussels to explain themselves and let them on the field. And that's the reason which was behind the creation of the MPCC. Tomorrow I will give you more details. Now it's shifting to a real ambition of having an operational headquarters. And I think changing its name at some point will be more understandable. So I would like to come back and focus only today on the support provided to Ukraine. To understand how it shaped our mindset, I will describe the different phases of the war. We are at the 4th one today, because it shaped our focus both in providing equipment and training. I will provide you details on the provision of military equipment through the European Peace Facility mechanism, explaining what it is. And finally, I will cover the EU military assistance mission to Ukraine, established in November last year. So, to come back to the war, the phases of the war. The first phase of the war, launched on the 24th of February, was a full-scale invasion aiming at taking Kyiv and get rid of President Zelensky's government. The immediate response of Western countries, but also the reaction of Ukrainian forces executing quite swiftly the plans they had on such a scenario prevented them to succeed. And this campaign failed. It would never have failed without immediate response from Western countries, being within the EU or also allies, UK, US, and others. So for this phase, what Ukraine needed was very strong mobility, very light teams able to target and aim at Russian vehicles which were stuck in axis and roads. I think you still have in mind the TV picture of this column of 60 kilometers long of armored vehicles coming from Belarus to Kiev, stuck in a road. It was like hunting an elephant in a corridor. So that was quite a good, successful story for the Ukrainian, provided that they had in hands, because we all focused on that, light weaponry like manpads, anti-tank, and Stinger missiles anti-air. So they could move very quickly, hiding themselves with very light teams, target wherever they wanted, and vanish after that. And we have to remember also that at this time, end of February, the snow was melting. So everywhere else on the side of the roads, it was mud. It was not practical. It's a bit strange as planning from a country like Russia. That's certainly one of the lessons, and I will come back on lessons learned tomorrow. Second phase, starting in April 22, so was a shift of focus from Russia forces to secure territories in separatist areas, Donbass, and trying to make the junction between Donbass and Crimea, and if feasible, between Crimea and Transnistria in Moldavia. So the war shifted from a very mobile one to a frontline war. In that context, the Ukrainian authorities requested us different kind of material, heavy material. They requested battle tanks. They requested long-range artillery, and still, of course, air defense. Last September, so it was a kind of frontline war, not moving that much, and that gave time to Ukraine to build up the capacity with our support to take back the initiative. That started in last September. And they pushed back Russia in some areas, especially the north of Donbass. And they got back some of the lost territories. But in retaliation, the Russians adapted their strategy to aim at decreasing the moral strength of the entire population by targeting everywhere in the territory critical civilian infrastructure with cruise missiles and drones, most of those drones provided by Iran. The intent was to use winter as a mass destruction weapon. This phase was a race before some expected stabilization during winter. Ukraine seized back Kherson as most visible success, but winter made still possible urban fighting, as we have seen in the fierce Battle of Bakhmut. During that phase, the priorities of the Ukrainian forces regarding military equipment were similar than in phase 2, but with a stronger focus on air defense for the reasons I've explained, but also starting to be concerned about the maintenance and repair of delivered equipment. In June, thanks to the equipment delivered, thanks to the training delivered, and I will come back on that later, and including modern battle tanks, to engage in the so-called counter-offensive. So Ukrainians were able to do it because they have amassed 12 new trained brigades that we trained in order to be able to conduct that so-called counteroffensive. As Mr. Kuleba mentioned this morning, this counteroffensive, the main effort being in Zaporizhia Oblast, to try to make the junction between the front line in the north and the coast, around Melitopol, maybe Mariupol area. Some people are thinking that this counteroffensive doesn't work really, is not as spectacular as they were expecting, but because it's wisely done. What we're talking, it's a distance of 120 kilometers from the front line to the sea. That means every kilometer gained is a success per se. And all this territory is covered by layers of defense, and especially heavy mined area. So you don't throw hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people just like that, just to the pleasure of seeing them exploding on mines. You do it carefully, you test, you breach, then you enter an area, and then you do it again. So I would not be so much worried about how visible is the counteroffensive. It's progressing. The challenge will be to reach the point they want to reach before or November at the latest. After that, we'll enter the winter season, while maneuvering will be more difficult. So it's feasible, it's challenging, and of course it will be feasible if we are able to sustain our support. So what they need on top of the heavy equipment and air defense for this counteroffensive are using a lot of long-range artillery. That means if you ask them what do you need, they will answer three things: ammunitions, ammunitions, ammunitions. So that's the battle for providing them with ammunitions and, of course, the mining capabilities as well. So this led the EU, under the leadership of Josep Borrell, to develop a special strategy on ammunitions, and I will come back shortly on that, not only for Ukraine, but also to recomplete our own stocks. Quick point on losses. Figures, of course, are difficult to consolidate, but a good estimation on the Russian side, I warn you that on the Ukrainian side, I will give no figure. We don't have them. They don't want to communicate on that, but we know it's heavy. On the Russian side, a good, reasonable estimation is that they have lost between 250,000 and 300,000 soldiers.
300,000?
Soldiers. Not all killed in action, but wounded in action, out of service, not usable anymore on the battlefield. Yes.
The Spanish army is 80,000.
Yeah.
It means more or less 3.5 times the Spanish army.
Well, they are using their people like in World War II, Stalingrad, waves of people, disregarding the losses and casualties. A reasonable figure also on the equipment is that they may have lost 60% of their total amount of battle tanks, 40% of their armored transport vehicles, 20% of their artillery, and a significant amount of aircrafts and helicopters. As you see, this war is not an air campaign war, and I think tomorrow I will explain that in the lessons learned. What I would like also, a point I would like to make, when we look at these different phases, the first, the 24th of February, were we surprised? Were we ready? I will say both. We were surprised because we had the same facts. The intelligence gave us the same facts than the US. We had exactly the same appreciation that if Russia wanted to do something, they will be ready second half of February. But we didn't draw the same conclusion. We didn't believe in the full-scale invasion at this stage. The US, because it was also fueling their narrative, were always saying they will go for a full-scale invasion. But were we ready? We never would be capable to take decision in 36 hours as we did, as the member states did, without being ready. And I would like to pay tribute to you, Josep Borrell, because we have to remember that you were in Ukraine in January, so 1 month before the invasion. And the authorities, President Zelensky, Kuleba, and Reznikov, told you they are going for the full-scale invasion. What will you be able to do? We understand that you cannot deploy troops, and NATO cannot either. But will you be able to provide us with equipment? Will you be able to impose sanctions to Ukraine? So when you came back with this outcome, we started to think about what we could put in the drawer in case of. And that's so the ideas were already thought through, not in the details, but we knew we were able to put something on the table. So let's go back to the military assistance, the provision of equipment. I have a very vivid memory on the first days and the discussions we all had together. And when over the weekend, member states, based on the proposal from you, decided to use the European Peace Facility, a quite new instrument, to provide a first tranche of 500 million euros to support member states providing military equipment to Ukraine. Keep that in mind. In 36 hours, the EU, most of the time assimilated until now to some kind of soft power, decided unanimously to use money to provide lethal weapon to a country at war. If you would have asked me that 1 month before, I would have almost laughed at the idea. Before we examine how we proceeded for the Ukraine, let me remind you the mechanism of the European Peace Facility. The European Peace Facility has been adopted in 2021, so you see just 1 year before the war. After 2 years of negotiation, I can tell you it was not a given to convince some member states that we needed an instrument to provide military equipment, including lethal equipment. You know, I remember some member states asking us, what do you mean by lethal? This kind of weapon that are killing other people? I say, yeah, that's roughly the idea behind it. So I would like to pay tribute to Germany, who succeeded during their tough presidency under COVID, succeeded in having those negotiations bearing fruit to this instrument. So it's out of the European Union budget. Why? Because the treaty forbids to use the European budget for any military purpose. It's not helpful for us, I can tell you. We have to be imaginative most of the time. So it is a common cost mechanism to finance common security and defense policy in a military framework. It took over the legacy of former instruments like Athena to support CSDP operations and missions, and the former African Peace Facility in support of some countries, mainly used in human resource support. The second pillar of the European Peace Facility, the new one, the assistance measure pillar, allows now to provide military equipment, including lethal, as I said, to partners, if so decided by the 27 member states. So before 21, it was not possible to deliver military equipment, especially lethal, to partners. Other competitors used that kind of weakness, especially in Africa. That's how Wagner put feet, especially in South African Republic and then in Mali. It's worth to mention that, as the Austrian Minister of Defense reminded, there is, in the procedure, the constructive abstention, allowing member states which do not want to finance lethal equipment to report their due amount on non-lethal, not blocking the system, but saying, okay, I don't pay for military equipment, but for lethal equipment, but I will put the equivalent amount of money to the non-lethal. To illustrate how it works, when the 27 member states agree on a military assistance measure of a certain amount, each member state will pay a quota portion of it, based mainly on some consideration of respective GDP when adopted in 21. For instance, Germany will pay 25%, France 18%, Poland 3.7%, Estonia 0.2%. I think Spain is just below 10%. So it's heavy burden depending from what member states you are. Initially, the budget ceiling of European Peace Facility was established at 5.7 billion euros for the time frame 21-27. So how it works for Ukraine? So when the war started, we saw, especially in the media, some announcement of member states saying, I will deliver this to Ukraine, I will deliver that to Ukraine, and we felt the need to try to coordinate and put some coherency behind that, and especially to make sure that the offers were matching the request from Ukraine. So we established in the EU military staff what we have called the clearing house cell, where we gathered all the member states, but also partners, US, UK, Australia, South Korea, Canada, Norway, NATO, and so on. And it was very interesting that the first discussion we had with NATO at this stage, NATO told us, well, that's fine, we cannot appear in the front line as NATO institution, so EU will deliver weapons and we'll do the humanitarian business, kind of the upside-down word at this time. And this first meeting allowed by the Saturday to have the clear picture of what the member states' intentions were and to justify the use of the first tranche of European Peace Facility of 500 million euros, because we had the figure about over 600 million euros of, I would say, promises of delivering by member states. So this worked pretty well to confront the request from the Ukrainian to the offers from member states, allowing member states to focus on the need. For instance, the Ukrainians told us, don't give us little weapons and little munitions. We have plenty of that. We don't need that. So all the member states ready to deplete their stocks of what they don't need. And with those little weapons, we told them, no, don't do that. You are not helpful if you are doing that. So it allowed, with no real authority, but it allowed anyone to focus and to shift the focus within the different phases of the war, as I explained previously. So the clearinghouse cell has been officialized through a conceptual framework endorsed by Council decision. And for the Ukraine, it's based on a reimbursement mechanism. So that means the member states deliver and they request reimbursement at a rate which is decided among the 27. It's usually between 50 and 60%. And I will explain why, because we do not have enough money in the European Peace Facility to cover everything. So the Director General of EUMS I was at this time, I was given a very strong responsibility to take decisions for the eligibility of member states' request to the European Peace Facility mechanism through simple criteria. Need to be on the first priority list of equipment officially provided by Ukraine. needs to be within a speed of relevance time frame, 6 weeks to submit the request from delivery to the submission. Not promise, I will give that next year. Needs to be delivered, not promised. And value is normally the used equipment value, not the replacement value. I give you an example. The first battle tanks provided by Czech Republic, T-72, former Soviet era tank, were old one, and you could have 2 for 1 million euros. Reasonable. It's of course not the price of 2 Leopard, Leclerc, or Abrams tank to replace them.
So two tanks for 1 million euros.
Yeah, 2 T-72 for 1 million euros. So that was a good deal at this time. We had, of course, no clue of the value, so we had to establish a kind of catalog of used military equipment by cross-checking between the different member states and by requesting them justification of the amount requested. So it worked very well as an incentive and help to focus on the military equipment needed. It still work. I will give you some amount there. But before that, after that, I will address on the ammunition. So where are we? When I left my command end of June this year, I had received at this time for about 11 billion euros of request. 11 billion euros. And I decided the eligibility of about 9 billion euros among this figure. It's not up to me to say it's no more eligible because we have no more money. I was just taking decision, okay, it's matching the criteria, so it's eligible, and you member states will discuss after that how you will apply the reimbursement mechanism. And by saying that, I would say 11 billion euros, it's about 2/3 of the value of the total military equipment delivered by the EU. So we are about today at 16 billion euros of military equipment delivered. So there is nothing to be ashamed of. There has been some bashing about the poor effort of EU. It's a nonsense. We are relatively, in the comparison with the United States, we are spending the same percentage of EU GDP than the US GDP for military assistance measure.
The same
to,
percentage
yes.
of GDP?
Yes.
16 billion in our side.
Yes.
The American figure is 40 billion.
Yeah, but their GDP is a bit more. Yeah. So yeah, we are roughly comparable. I mean, so don't give ground to any bashing on our military assistance. So the key challenge is the sustainability of the equipment. I remind that I gave you the word of a total sailing of 5.7 billion euros. Today, 8 tranches have been adopted, so we are above 4 billion euros only for Ukraine. But European Peace Facility is a global instrument, so that means around Ukraine, the world still exists. Some other partners need to be supported in Africa, everywhere, in the Balkans. And so we cannot sustain this rhythm where we need a tranche of 500 million euros around every 10 to 12 weeks if we keep the sailing that way. That's the reason why the member states have decided first to top up this sailing of 5.7 billion euros by 2 additional billion euros, and now they are in discussion. I lost track, but I don't think it has been adopted yet, but it's under discussion to second top-up of 3.5 billion euros. And part of it will be kind of in a sanctuary to support the rest of the world. The 2 billion euros top up, in fact, were already consumed right away in the approach to provide the munitions. As I told you, what they need, munitions. So we had to elaborate a particular strategy to be able to deliver munitions to them and to us. So the High Representative proposed a 3-track approach to the member states. The first track was, in a limited time frame, to ask the member states to deplete more their stock in any kind of munitions calibers, being NATO standard or former Soviet era standards. 1 billion euros was dedicated to that first track. We say with some average success. No, the time is over, so the money is back in the European Peace Facility for standard for Ukraine. The target was to deliver by the end of the year 1 million rounds of ammunition. This allowed to cover 1/3 of it. The second track is to help the member states to negotiate with the industry by joint procurement. So it's organized by the European Defence Agency. When the member states have a common project, they need to be 3 at the minimum, say, okay, we want to procure jointly this kind of ammunition, then the European Defence Agency or some framework nation will negotiate on their behalf with the industry with a critical mass of order that will be a good business model. And the third track, in the hands led by the Commission, is to help the defense industry to ramp up their capacity of delivery, both in time and quantity. And so I would say that the challenge also is to have that implemented before the end of the year. And that's for the munitions, but ramping up the industry, the defense industry, is the key issue we have today, and that will be, I think, a topic for tomorrow. Then I will go, and that will be my last chapter, if I can say, about the training. So the Ukrainian authorities were trained either bilaterally or by the UK, not that much by the US or Canada through old training operations. So they officially requested the EU to establish a mission to train them. So end of August 22, during a Foreign Affairs Council, informal one in Prague, the 27 member states decided to implement a common security and defense policy military mission to assist and train Ukrainian armed forces. That decision was based on this request, and so it was really, I would say, a very interesting dialogue. Council decision to establish the mission was adopted on the 17th of October 22. The objective was to launch the mission of the 15th of November. That means I can tell you 1 month between the Council decision and the launching of the mission is a European record. We have never been so fast in doing things. Some previous missions, like Mozambique, were fast and were a precedent record, but then we have never been so fast. So the planning teams, both in the EU military staff and the MPCC, worked very hard with a daily contact with the Ukrainian to shape the mission and the aim of the mission. So the aim of the mission, as labeled by the Council decision, is to contribute to the reinforcement of the Ukrainian armed forces' military capacities to regenerate and conduct efficient operations in order to defend its territorial integrity within internationally internationally recognized borders, efficiently exercise its sovereignty, and protect civilian people. Training is based on Ukrainian needs and has been also adapted through the last phase of the war since it has been established. So the mission delivers individual and collective training on combat up to battalion and brigade command level, including a lot of live firing, specialized training like combat engineering, sappers, demining, combat medical support, or more recently, pilot training, including F-16 pilot training, potentially training of territorial defense forces, and today we have added, on request of Ukraine, the young leadership training, non-commissioned officers, young officers from lieutenant to captain, as they have lost so many of them, they need a leadership. So the challenge of that is the quality versus speed of relevance. To illustrate what we are doing, when we take a battalion, so about 150 people, 85% of them have zero military experience. They are coming from the civilian. They have integrated a database, volunteering to serve, to defend their country. The Ukrainian authorities are selecting them. They are not selecting the same people from infantry battalion or a tank crew, for instance, and they are sending them to us. We take 4 weeks from zero, from scratch, to have a battalion able to maneuver and to coordinate fires inside the battalion and with other battalions. They are heavily motivated, also sometimes heavily conscious about the risk, and that may be the last time they will face some comfort, but very highly motivated, and that works well. So we have established 2 subordinate commands, one in Poland, the Combined Armed Training Center Command, and one in Germany to coordinate training on German soil, which is called the Special Training Center. Also, 18 member states are taking part in that mission today, and most of them also are conducting training in their own territory, as in Spain with a very efficient Toledo training command that has been established. Mission is coordinating with all other relevant actors, especially the huge coordination center established under US leadership in Wiesbaden, called Security Assistance Group for Ukraine, SAGU, as well as with the UK with the training operation Interflex. We have a joint coordination training conference every month, and I will give you some figures. Our mission is so successful that the US general commanding that asked me right away to co-sign the invitation letter, co-chair those training conference, and co-sign the minutes of it. It's a really wonderful recognition by the US on our success. Where are we today? The first objective was to train 15,000 soldiers within the 2-year framework mandate. This objective has been reached in 7 months. So the High Representative proposed to double that figure, to aim for 30,000 trained soldiers. If we keep the rhythm we are today, this figure will be reached by mid-October, the latest. That means you may certainly announce at the next informal FAC difference that we can do more than this target. So despite this tremendous success, some challenges remain, and I will finish almost there. Again, financial sustainability. The mission is supported by a dedicated European Peace Facility measure. First, the operational pillar, is about 107 million euros, and it's enough today, but will not cover 2 years of mandate. Then the assistance measure pillar was initially 16 million euros for lethal equipment, 1/6, necessary for training, mainly ammunition, and 45 million euros for non-lethal, individual gears, sleeping bags, and so on. When I left my command, our projection for lethal equipment was above 100 million euros before the end of the year. So, and that's explained by the speed of the training, which was not foreseen, but also new equipment. It's not the same cost to train a battalion with normal vehicles or with Leopard, of course. So that has been an increased cost, and we will have to sustain. So my conclusion, I will not go, as I said, through lessons learned. I will maybe go tomorrow on that, but it's not over. Whatever success as the counter-offensive today, it will not end that war in Ukrainian mind. There will need to be followed by others. That means we have to sustain our effort of providing equipments, of providing training. So I would say almost for the equipment, I'm not sure finance is the main issue. The capability of the industry of the member states depleting their stocks to provide more equipment is reaching its limits. That's the reason why it's so important to change the mindset of the defense industry to shift in war mode. And if you have to take away something from this conference, we have to sustain in a long time our center of gravity. The center of gravity of EU is the unity of the member states. The challenge will be to avoid any business as usual, any routine, any fatigue in the time. And our effort will have to be sustained in the future, because that's our credibility is at stake. So not only with finance, but also with our capacity to deliver. I will stop there.
Merci beaucoup, Amiral, merci beaucoup pour vos paroles, et surtout merci beaucoup pour ces années de travail. Bueno, así por lo menos ya saben ustedes cuánto.
Yes, you now know the cost of a second-hand tank. A T-72, you said a T-72, it's quite old, isn't it? And what was the cost that you mentioned? Yes, 244 million.
So 500,000 euros cada.
Yes, that's 500,000 each. That's the price of an apartment here in this beach area. And a Leopard? Entre 5 y 8 millones de euros cada uno.
Vayan teniendo estas cifras en la cabeza.
Keep these figures in mind, because it's important.
Los costes de lo que estamos hablando, ¿no?
It's important to be aware of the costs of everything we're talking about. So when we say that the Russian army has lost 2,000 tanks, that's the last verified figure through satellite. That was almost 2,000, 1,860 if I'm not wrong. So if we multiply this by 5 million per each one of them, wow, that's a big amount. It is true the economic and material costs of this war is tremendous, and the reconstruction of Ukraine will be even more. without, of course, taking into account human lives, 300,000 casualties, which is a very high number. It's an average of 500 people per day.
O sea, es una guerra de alta intensidad.
It's a high intensity war.
Ha perdido el ejército.
Yes, 1 battalion per day. And of course, it's not for free either on the other side. Well, I guess you now understand how the system works. Beyond this, each member state, and please correct me if I get this wrong, each member state has provided a military house without going through the clearinghouse and without asking for the reimbursement. Is that so?
Most of the member states have gone through the clearinghouse, but not all the equipment have gone through the clearinghouse. 2/3 of the equipment have gone through the clearinghouse.
Bueno, que sepan que no hay una...
Be aware that there's not an exact figure of military aid to Ukraine because not all member states give us the specific data on what exactly they are doing on their own. What they've done through the clearinghouse we know about, but the aid they provided directly is something that we don't know about because not everyone tells or gives the information. Some do and some don't. Therefore, the figures are estimated figures. But we have good estimates. And that's what brings us to 12 billion.
And 16 billions in total.
16 mil millones en total. En cambio, los Estados
On the other hand, the US does give very, very detailed information and data. They give us the number of rounds for each of the different weapons and what exactly they supplied. This morning, the Lithuanian minister and myself said that we've enlarged or broadened the type of help. We started with the helmets, and now we are with the F-16s. And I could go on and on about this, because as the Admiral said, the mission for training, where you're going to be training 30,000 soldiers, many of them with zero experience, have you said, when they got to the training centers. So let's open the floor. Let's see if there are any questions.
A ver, ¿quién hace aquí de...? ¿Podéis decir quiénes sois?
Please introduce yourselves before asking the question. So we have a sociological analysis of who is here. First of all, thank you so much. My name is Carlos Navalón. I come from the Foreign Affairs Service in Andalusia. And I have several questions, because the issue is very different to what we usually confront. Unfortunately, one of them has to do with the weapons that the European Union member states have sent to Ukraine. Which kind of weapons have had a greater impact regarding the attacks on Russia? And another question is regarding spying and counter-spying. Has the EU participated or provided any kind of aid of any kind to the European military? And what have they worked on, or what have they contributed with? Thank you.
Vamos a coger varias preguntas.
Let's take several questions, and then you can choose the ones that you consider to be more relevant or interesting for you. Good afternoon, and thank you for your presentation. I was very interested in hearing how all the arms contribution or help was organized. So this was very interesting for me. But I do have a couple of doubts. One of them is logistics. How do you get the weapons there? For example, the tanks that leave Zaragoza in Spain, how do they get to the front in Ukraine? What is the route? And I don't know if you can give me an answer to this. And also, I would like to know your view. After the war, or as the war evolves, is the kind of army that is being formed in the Ukraine? At what level will they be in the future regarding training, combat experience, and even the handling of modern weapons? What is the experience of the Ukrainian army going to be? Well, we won't tell you the way in which we get the weapons into the country. We cannot tell you that. Hello, my name is Pamela. I'm director of Coopera Mundo. And regarding the European Peace Facility that you've mentioned, together with international action in Latin America. For example, if we look at Peru and what is happening and the violence in Peru, the disappearances and deaths and so on and so forth, do you have in mind going there, being present there, or doing something in Peru? Because I know the Parliament has said something about this, as well as the United Nations, but I don't know if this is something that European Peace Facility will do something about. Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, and thank you so much for your presentation. I also have a couple of questions. The first one, it is true that 1 battalion per day seems to be a difficult figure, but Russia considers this, well, let's say, okay, as well as its society. How is it possible for this to be maintained, and up to when we will be able to maintain these levels of human losses? And my next question, and I don't know if it's possible for you to answer this, but of these 30,000, let's say, soldiers that are going to be trained, the voluntary soldiers that are being trained by the European mission, how many of them speak Russian and how many speak Ukrainian? Thank you.
Pregunta.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Alfonso Bulgon. I am the director of the Defense Cluster. And we've started our own initiative. We have what is called the Expert in Electronic War, and this is taught at the Cantabrian University. And I would like to know how you're supporting Ukraine regarding these aspects.
Hola, buenos días.
Hello. I am a student of international relations and history, and if we look at the costs of the war for all Europeans, and we take into account the aim of Ukraine of maintaining the integrity of its territory, will we maintain that support until they get Crimea back, or when will we stop? Oh my God, your questions are too much. One last question then.
Hola, me llamo Yo Castro.
My name's Jorg Castro, and I'm a law student. First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you for your incredible talk. My question is, when we talk about sending supplies and weapons to the Ukrainian army and to international bodies that are supporting via humanitarian Ukraine, do you think that part of the problem of sending weapons is that because the EU member states that have difficulties in sending weapons that may end up in Russian hands, is that a problem? Because if these kinds of weapons with secret technology in it, could Russia end up using this against European countries? But sorry about my nerves.
Well, I'll try to be shorter than in my presentation, conscious of the time, but I will try to get to more other questions. So regarding the most efficient weapons in Ukrainian hands, I think the long-range precise artillery is certainly one of the game changer because they are able to target exactly the military targets they want to target, avoiding also collateral damages, even if there are not really any more civilian population in this area, and destroying a lot of equipment. Today, they are aiming at multiple rocket launch system, and we have figures that they are destroying more than, I mean, it's dozens every day. And those weapons are hurting them. So by destroying them, it's helpful. And that also means that they have the ability to locate those weapons, which is interesting. About counter-spying, yeah, there is a huge game on that. We don't provide specific support to Ukraine because they are well organized on that, but we are taking care of our own counter-spying within EU member states. The UMAM mission is targeted. Some spies have been arrested around and related to try to understand how we were working. Brussels is a nest of spies. I can tell you the number of Russian cultural advisors hanging around is quite interesting. We are targets. I'm sanctioned. I'm blacklisted by Wagner and so on. I'm not anymore because I'm nobody today. But yes, we have to be conscious that it's not only in a James Bond movie that things are happening. That's the reality. So we are very much aware on that, including in the cyber environment. Logistic. So I can give you some details, not all the details. So some member states close to the border have established very efficient logistic hub. So everything is arriving there by plane, by train, by road, is gathered there, is taken into account by Ukrainian counterparts, and then they made them cross the border, and then the means they are using there, you understand that we don't give that much detail because we don't want that to be targeted by Russia, but it's working very efficiently and also related to some questions about the tracking and the wariness about all those weapons. It's everything that crosses the border is known, is registered, every serial number and so on, including by the custom of this country. So there is a kind of double accountability that allows us to really keep track of everything we have given, and also because tracking, and that's a concern for the UN, tracking is very important to understand what those weapons are, where are they, how they are used, and so on. Are they diverted somewhere else? We had a mission because the European Peace Facility also consists in checking and tracking everything that is being given. A mission has been to Ukraine on that, and they were quite reassured by the tracking ability on the logistic side of the Ukrainian armed forces to know what they are doing. We cannot avoid, linked to that question also, we cannot avoid that some equipment may be captured, but without entering details, for the sophisticated equipments, Ukraine have the order to destroy them if instead of have them capturing them. In the other way, quite a lot of interesting equipments from Russia have been also captured, and when you look at them, they are full of Chinese chips. It's wonderful. So, yeah, yes, but a lot of Chinese at this present time. So what army in the future? What I can tell you is that today we are in life-saving surgery. The healing will be another therapy. So the Ukrainian army in the future, let's say, to come back to the question asked to Mr. Kuleba, 10 years from now, where we will be, it will be very much different than what we are doing today. We are really rushing in emergency mode, trying to put everything we can to train everyone. Then there will be a challenge, but also our role to support Ukraine to organize a stable and European, that means mainly NATO standard, regular army able to face any future threat. So there will be a time after when the peace will be there, the sooner the better, when we'll have to set everything back and then rebuild things. It's not sustainable for them to have millions of different equipment, for instance. So they will have to rationalize also the equipment and the construction. So, and maybe there will be, I think there will be room for the EU to support that. Maybe the EU military assistance mission would be transformed in EU council mission, for instance, to help that. Maintenance, how they can sustain losses on the Russian side and also on Ukrainian side, the question is relevant, where they are still hundreds of thousands of people. It's different on both sides. On the Russian side, they are forced to be mobilized, so that means their willingness to go to fight maybe not the most enthusiastic one. In Ukraine, they are all registered in a database, also a bit convinced to register. You remember at the beginning of the war that men were forbidden to leave the country. Their family could, but men were forbidden. The thing is that on the Russian side, mobilization is not popular, and they send those people with almost no training and almost no equipment. So again, the sad picture of World War II, where they were sending waves of unexperienced soldiers, is still happening today. And so they can sustain, but what impact it will have in the Russian society, I cannot tell you. Today they are trying to hide. You know, there are very few funerals in Russia. Why that? Because they don't repatriate bodies. Most of the time they burn them in Ukraine. But because so it's not visible. But at some point, the families will react. But there is a pervert effect. I've been told that in some villages, they had a lot of losses, husbands, sons, fathers, but they receive money. And those villages are living better today than they were living before. So there is a kind of pervert effect where they could consider, well, there is some benefit from what's going on. Very, very strange. So on electronic warfare, it's a field where which is very active in Ukraine, in all domain, because we need they need to get the information, and they need to counter the information, and any kind of acquiring information through electronic warfare is used, but also, you know, blurring and everything, jamming, everything is used also to counter the possibility of the enemy, and they are doing that on both sides. So it's certainly the importance of electronic warfare in an intensive battlefield has never been so high. Maintain the support as until when, until where? Well, it's an interesting question. It's a very political one. It's the definition of the victory. We have talked about victory. So Ukraine winning the war. What does that mean? That means getting back to the borders of the 24. That means getting back with the entire Donbass. That means getting back Crimea. All those steps are different in nature and may have different consequences. And today, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you have been discussing with the authorities, in their mind, it's getting back everything. It's getting back to the internationally recognized borders. We may not be as much comfortable as with that at some point. We'll have to, even if we have been supporting that speech all the time, we'll have to think about when we think it will be time to set up the end of the match. And
Admiral, you cannot be fired, but I can be fired. So,
so yes. I think I've covered roughly all the questions.
Thank you. Bueno, mucho retraso y el siguiente panel.
We are delayed. The next panel is going to be really interesting. I don't know if you want a 10-minute technical stop, but no more than that, please. And then we'll need to come back here. Warm hand for our speaker. Thank you.
Non, c'est les gens qui... Ça a été très intéressant. Toute cette information...
Oui, c'est pour ça que c'est ouvert, pratiquement. Après, c'est agencé, donc ça facilite les choses, mais je crois qu'on peut pas se restreindre. Oui, non.
Vamos allá. Dejamos. Uy, esto está muy alto, ¿no? Bueno, los que hayan... Eso está muy alto. Juan? Los que hayan resistido...
Those you have resisted the temptation to go down to the beach, let's start so that those that have resisted the temptation can actually enjoy the beach later. And now we're going to get down to our main course. The previous conversations and talks were fantastic, very well researched, but now we're getting down to the main course because now we're going to see how we can approach such a complex issue, i.e. the war, any war. We're going to have different viewpoints about why the war started and how it can end. We need this to be a lively debate, first of all amongst yourselves and then with the attendees. I'm going to introduce you. Do we have any CVs? They're going to introduce who they are. They're going to introduce themselves. But if they introduce themselves, each and every one of them, they may censor what they want to say. No, you can say whatever you want. I'll start, and I'll add some additions if I think you haven't explained who you are. Today, or this morning, we listened to politicians, and now we've got analysts with us. Firstly, Borja Las Heras is going to talk to us about what we can learn from what's happened and what's happening on the ground, the lessons learned of what we've already experienced and what we're experiencing now. Then Jesus Núñez will talk about what the European Union is doing and what the European Union can do. And thirdly, we'll hear from Cristina Manzano, who's going to talk to us about how we should think about reconstruction. So let's start with Borja Las Heras, who's going to be talking about what we're learning from what's happening on the ground. Ready? You can explain who you are. Good morning. My name is Borja Las Heras, and I'm a researcher at the Center for European Policy Analysis. And I thought it would be a good idea to get across to you the view of the Russian war in the civilian population in Russia. I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I've been there since before and after what's called the Great Invasion. I've spent between 3 and 4 months in the country, in Kharkiv, in the east and in the south as well. I don't think in our society we've really understood correctly the dimension of what's going on. So I'm going to give you some figures that you may find interesting to start with. But first, let's show you a little video.
Bien, dos cosas. Lo primero que nos...
Couple of things. The first thing that you heard, firstly, you're going to listen to it first. The first thing that you heard in the background was what a air raid siren sounds like, and then an explosion. This is in Kharkiv. Kharkiv is like Barcelona. It's the second largest city in in Ukraine. Why, first of all, this siren, air raid siren? Because this happens every day in Ukraine when there are reconnaissance drones nearby, when there are Russian planes in the air, and when there are missiles in the air. There's another app which you use which tells you about these air raid sirens. It tells you when they're going to be happening. Just to give you an idea, I checked the app this morning, and ever since this huge invasion, over 29,000 air raid sirens have rung out. That's 54 per day. And I cannot even get across to you, even hope to get across to you, how how nervous this makes you when you hear these kind of air raid sirens, and if you hear it all the time, but it's a reality that Ukrainians have got used to.
Esto no es Kabul.
This isn't Kabul, this is Kiev, on the 8th of May this year. What you can hear at in the background is the nose of a drone and the air defense systems that are being shot by the Ukrainians. Russian has set off around 1,000 drones since September last year and July this year. They're mainly Iranian drones. But recently they've started producing them nationally. This is a bad piece of news. I don't know if you remember in October, Iranian drones over Kiev. I remember the news. They're now no longer news because they fly over every day. I've recorded the different air attacks and I've completely lost count of the number. Why? Because the logic is the following. Firstly, to saturate air defenses with drones so that Ukrainians actually use their air defense mechanisms and then send missiles afterwards. And the missiles, this is what happens when you send a missile. This is a Russian missile that struck a shopping center in Kremenchuk in June 2022. Kremenchuk is a long way from the front. It's not a priority target, but unfortunately this, which may be striking to you, is something that also happens quite frequently in Ukraine. Russia hasn't, and I haven't got the exact figures, but we think that Russia's have shot around 5,000 missiles against Ukraine. I actually totted up the figures for May. If you talk about drones and missiles, and in May, there's an average of 20 missiles and drones every single day that are being shot out. Thanks to Western support, and I'll talk about that later, Ukraine manages to intercept many of these missiles and drones. But of course, all you need is for one to hit its target to create the equivalent of a terrorist attack, and that happens on many occasions.
Unfortunately, Russia is producing around 100,000 missiles per month, and as the High Representative mentioned, 60% of the technical components are Western components, which lengthens the war. As you can see, I'm not talking about the front at all, because what's fundamental that I'm speaking about is happening in areas that are not the front. Why? Because this is part of the Russian policy to take the war against the civil population. I have had more fear in areas further away from the front than when I've been at the front. I can give you 3 objectives that the Russians have. Some of the targets are just civil targets in whatever classification of human rights. For example, hospitals, housing. And we've seen grain infrastructure as all the energy infrastructure throughout the winter. Why? Because they wanted to not only kill them through cold, but to make them feel so bad that there will be a revolt, a rebellion of the civilians. But mainly these are civil targets and therefore war crimes. The others are what are usually called collateral damage. But if we look at this shopping center in Kremenchuk, well, in international law, this is also a war crime, because you know there's going to be the casualties of a civil society, and they want to create this from Russia because this is a punishment operation. And then of course there's military targets, like now when they are attacking more airports where supposedly Ukrainians have aircrafts that have missiles. Another figure, children, around 19,000 that we know. At least 19,000 have been deported to Russia. And you believe deportations were something that happened in the 40s and 50s, something that Stalin did, also the Nazis, something that we cannot wrap our head around with. This is also like in Argentina with kids that were taken, but this is even worse. And why children? Because of course they are the future of the country. So if you take the children away and you take Russian citizens to Ukraine so that it stops being Ukraine. Another figure, children from 0 to 9-year-olds, according to the Center of Economic Strategy of Kiev, around 50% of them are outside Ukraine. What does this mean? That or either things change or they will probably won't come back to Ukraine. So when sometimes we speak about Russia, and I'm going to show you a video of the official television in Russia.
Estos no son periodistas.
These are not independent journalists. This is an official channel in Russia. They receive instructions of what they have to do at least once per week. In this media, they defend the destruction of Ukraine, and you can just see it because there's people and even researchers on war crimes that are studying everything that is being said in these televisions. So what I want to say is that sometimes it is difficult to conceive that the destruction of Ukraine is a fundamental target of Russia, but it is. The destruction of Ukraine, and if they cannot conquer Ukraine, to destroy it. A few months back, I was in Odessa, and my friends from Odessa said that more or less, well, the local say that as the Russians still have properties in Odessa, the city is still protected from bombings, but this has stopped. And now they believe that Putin has reached the conclusion that they cannot take Odessa, so therefore they want to destroy Odessa. And areas where I went for a drink have been fully destroyed, as well as Kharkov, to destroy and conquer everything that they can. The people think about the Donbass area, but the Donbass is a very minimum area that they target. They target many other territories too. Therefore, now they have to conquer the rest of the Donbass as well as the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson. Which brings me to different conclusions. This is not only a war on territory. What Russia literally wants is for Ukraine to disappear. They get rid of museums and everything, or end of this being Ukraine. And even today in the news, the Russian document has been filtered that talks about repopulating Mariupol, that is in the coast, where 400,000 people used to live. Now there's around 100,000. 20 to 30,000 died in the bombing. So the plan is to bring Russian population so that little by little it loses or stops being Ukraine. This is one of the reasons why there's a counter-offensive. They are losing their country. What's the bad news? Well, Russia adapts. And now basically their objective is to get more time. They want to get more time to be stronger. As you've seen recently, they've decided to increase the age of conscription and to lengthen the period in which the officials continue to work. That is something that you do when you want your army to grow. Why? Because they want a long war. So they want us to speak about negotiation, but they have no intention of negotiating. But it's good for them. because what some think is that at least they want to lengthen the war at least till 2024, wherein there will be U.S. elections and so on and so forth, even till the beginning of 2025. That's their theory of victory, and it's not a theory of victory that is based on nothing, as I said, but because instead of conquering Ukraine, they destroy it and they make it not feasible for investors. And I'm going to finish now. The war is not going to end. If we look at the situation nowadays and if we look at what their counteroffensive is doing, if it's going to fail or not, this is, let's say, champagne for Putin, because it gives him the view that sooner or later he will have opportunities. And it won't finish because the sanctions allow Russia to continue manufacturing. They continue to be able to purchase oil that funds the war. And because our High Representative also mentioned this, we have lost golden opportunities. A year ago, I did an interview in which I said, and this was November, and you can find this interview where I said, this is the moment. Now, a year later, we've lost many chances. We've talked about tanks, 60 tanks, which is basically what Spain has in Zaragoza, in its warehouse. So, and to conclude, this is a production or a manufacturing war and an industrial war. Therefore, in these conditions, you need to produce more than your adversary, and you need to destroy their production lines. Russia is destroying the Ukrainian production lines, but Ukraine cannot do so with the Russian ones. And of course, there's an issue of regenerating forces. The Admiral mentioned this, but Ukraine has lost a great part of its army during the last year because it's been a year and a half of ongoing offensive. And a great part of the first tactic problems have to do with units that were recently formed. And I will stop here to give time to the other speakers.
Buenas tardes, gracias por la oportunidad.
Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity of being here once again in this QUO VADIS course that I hope continues through the years. And I will be speaking about something that I've been dealing with for a few years now. My name is Jesus Núñez. I am co-director of the Institute for Studies on Conflict and Humanitarian Action that has its headquarters in Madrid and that has existed for 23 years. This was going to be a short war, but the Hostomel battle was a turning point. If the Russians would have been able to take this close area close to the airport, this would have allowed them to bring units, parachute units to take the city, and therefore being able to defeat Zelensky and its government. Today we will be smiling to Putin, saying no one is perfect, but things went wrong. And the Ukrainian soldiers have all the merit of being able, with very little equipment, to be able to confront an operation that combined the entrance through Belarus with helicopters, together with a mechanized column also coming from Belarus, and parachute air transport units from Russian territory. But things went wrong, and now things are different. And as Borja mentioned, we are in a long war that is interesting for one side but not the other, because I understand that Ukraine wants the war to be as short as possible, obviously, but not everyone has the same interest. And Russia, now that it hasn't achieved its initial aim, wants a long war in which demographic difference is significant. where they can also have an advantage because of their production capacity after destroying the capacity of Ukraine, because Russia, as Borja says, has the capacity of continuing to generate weapons. So from that standpoint, we can also see what the EU is doing in this context, and the 27 member states can see how we're doing things. And usually the analyst has a critical view regarding the official discourse or narrative. But in my mind, there's no doubt Russia is the aggressor. If they don't abandon and then the main responsible for everything we're seeing is Russia. There's no nuance to what I've just said. From here onwards, and reflecting what the EU is doing, has been doing after the war, and what they're doing regarding peace. If I focus on my first comments on the war context, it is true, and there is no doubt that what the EU has done up till now is absolutely extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. If we compare the EU and its political capacity to put decisions in place, and we compare this with 11 rounds of sanctions and the use of the European peace facility, as it has been done up till now, and this 16 billion that were mentioned, it's extraordinary. But also, when you think about the Arab-Israeli conflict, these ideas come to your mind too. I've participated in discrete participations between Palestinians and Israelis, and when the citizens of Israel talked to us as mediators, they said, well, this is the maximum that we can offer them. And they didn't understand that their maximum wasn't the minimum that Palestinians needed to be able to reach an agreement. So if I apply this here, one thing is that the EU has done something that is extraordinary, but I don't know if it's enough for specific objectives. If the aim is to end the war, it hasn't been enough, because there continues to be a war and there will continue to be one. If we understand the EU, we can once again see how marvelous it has been, because taking into account the differences between the 27, achieving what has been achieved was something that was never expected. And getting this common minimum denominators has been extraordinary. So the EU, taking this into account, is working in the right direction to put in place the mechanisms that it already has, as well as knowing that other EU countries do whatever they can. And going to the other side of things, and that is trying to find peace, I go back to the issue of who is interested in a short or long war. And I have my doubts of the US being interested in a short war. Enormous doubts. If the US, with $45 billion, that is not even 44% of my defense budget, I'm able to annihilate the capacity of a strategic opponent like Russia, then something's not working out there. And if I am not the one suffering casualties, then things are working for me. And I'm not saying that this explains the behavior of ones or the others, but this is one other element to take into account in this context. Because as we've seen and we've mentioned during today's session, we've seen that we've established limits that have been gone over very quickly. And let me speak about a specific issue. Since the start of the year, we were always expecting and waiting for the Ukrainian counteroffensive that started in the last week of June. 6 months at least of wait. Why do we still continue to wait? What are we waiting for? So what is the idea? The idea is that with this offensive, we won't be speaking about peace. There won't be a possibility of peace, amongst other things, because Russia doesn't want peace, because it wants to dominate Ukraine if it can, or destroy it. Therefore, we're not going to speak about peace until the offensive ends. And therefore, that means that we want the offensive to end by recovering territorial integrity, at least everything except for Crimea, but Crimea being under artillery and making things more difficult for Russia to maintain it. Why haven't we given all the means to Ukraine to be able to reach this objective? Because as the Admiral already said, time is going by and we need to get to different targets before November, because if not, things will stop once again. And I go again, once again, over to the demographical and industrial superiority of Russia, and with Putin's behavior that doesn't mind having more than 300,000 casualties, as we're being told. Therefore, what has stopped us? Not the EU. I'm not demanding anything from the EU, because, as I'm saying, they're working on the minimum common denominator reached by the 27. But I'm talking about the US. And where, however we look at the figures, and if we look at the percentage of the GDP and so on and so forth, in fundamental terms, the US has given more to the Ukrainians. So why are we still discussing if there's 16 yes or not? And why not cruise missiles that are more precise, if we know that with no air support and artillery precision support, we won't be able to break 3 Russian defense lines that have been, at least during 8 months, consolidating on the territory. And now we say, well, the offensive is slow. It's slow compared to what? Because right now the Ukrainians don't want to leave their people to die at the front. Why don't you bring your own people then? Because if there's such a consolidated resistance as the Russian one, we can understand the offensive cannot just with one could be able to break that. And still we're seeing progress in different areas with specific operations. So from that standpoint, the first demand is, why haven't we provided more support, or why isn't there more support from the US and from the different states' governments? Why haven't they made the offensive get to targets like breaking the corridor that links to Crimea? And still we continue playing or talking about escalation. That is a trompe-l'oeil in my view, because where's the escalation? The Lithuanian minister, in fact, reminded us of this morning. Where's the escalation, the Russian escalation, now that there is a SIP after there was no serial agreement that was able to go through the Black Sea? We didn't have that reaction that was expected. And I know nuclear threat is there. How are we not able to be aware of this if we're talking about the first nuclear power in the world? And now let me go on to the next issue, and that is peace. And here we'll talk about the EU. Right now, peace is unthinkable of, because Russia doesn't want it. And that's the starting point, obviously. How do we make Russia listen? Meanwhile, there have been some initiatives that could lead us to a cease of hostilities, or some kind of a ceasefire. And we've had mediators everywhere, from Erdogan to Lula, Modi, a delegation of African countries. Why isn't there an initiative from the EU? Why did they just say whatever Ukraine says? Because at the end of the day, it will be these 10 points that Ukraine is mentioning, because if not, it seems that the EU nowadays, and maybe it's because of the area where I work, between the academia, NGO, media, but what we get, the idea that we is transmitted is that the EU seems to be an agent that is supporting war but not a peace, which is not true. Because the best way of getting peace is by supporting Ukraine right now. I have no doubt of this. But why? Let me be a bit cynical. EU that says at the same time we need a high precision cruise missiles, but this is our roadmap for peace. It will be useful or not, but we need the voice of the EU with an initiative that can get nowhere as Lula's or Erdogan's initiatives. But we haven't talked in those terms, which is something that I believe is necessary, because the EU, that is not a military alliance, something explained this morning and mentioned by the High Representative. Of course, it's not a military alliance, but it's in the military field now. So let's not only look at this profile of the EU, also let's become the ones that demand peace. At least so Russia will have to listen to us, whether one way or the other. If not, we are only reinforcing the military vision that is not the European one, but is the one that is out there if this is not compensated with a peace initiative. And this is what we should work on now, looking into what else can be done by the EU regarding peace that it's not doing right now. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, yo soy Cristina Manzano, actualmente.
Hello, I am Cristina Manzano, and now I'm, up till now, very recently I was director of S Global, and that's why I'm here today as an analyst and observer of the reality. As Joanna has said, I want to talk about reconstruction. In fact, we started and we are preparing the reconstruction. But before this, allow me to mention one other issue regarding what the EU can do to support Ukraine that has to do with foreign policy. And that is its role of also bringing different sides closer and explaining what is happening to Ukraine to countries that were not so close. And I would like to speak about the recent summit with the Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, where a declaration was achieved. I would like to congratulate the team that was able to achieve this, because it wasn't something that was clear, and only there was one country that didn't sign this declaration. And this was not foreseen. We didn't foresee to have a declaration, but it reinforces the role of international law, respect to territorial sovereignty, and so on and so forth. So also from the side of foreign policy with diplomacy, we are disseminating and changing the narratives in which Russia is more predominant. But let's talk about rebuilding. What to rebuild? What do we mean by rebuilding? How to finance it? And what is the model that we want to have, and how can the EU contribute and is contributed? Regarding what to rebuild, our first image is the physical reconstruction, and the degree of how cities has been destroyed is incredible. This the beginning of the invasion. And the Kiev School of Economics has followed up all the different damaged infrastructures with a network throughout the country. The last report published in June estimated in money the cost of the destruction in $150 billion. But this is just one part of the story. Has to do, and you've mentioned this, 167 housing buildings, 19 airports, more than 100 train stations, more than 300 schools. This is affecting kindergartens, but also high schools, universities, and also the other day we've heard about the energy system, which is one of the big challenges, and how Russia specifically is attacking these facilities, and of course how this is affecting businesses in Ukraine. But let's not forget that when we talk about rebuilding, we're also talking about the millions of people that had to either leave Ukraine or be displaced from their places where they lived. And this has happened really fast. It has been a very fast displacement compared to the reference of the Second World War. I would like to also talk here about what the EU can do, the response capacity, and the starting of a temporary directive that had not been existed up till now. We have to congratulate the countries, but we also, of course, have to compare them to the refugees coming from other places that do not receive the same treatment. But we have to reflect on how these people can go back to their country of origin, and knowing that there is a percentage that will stay in the places where they have been hosted, and also being aware that it has been a very flexible process up till now. There's a figure of 6 million people in the EU trying to find a refuge here. Well, we thought that this was going to be a very fast process. As regions were safer, people came back, so we don't have specific figures because there's a lot of flow of people. So how to fund all of this? I published an article asking this $1 million question, because the World Bank estimates a need of $400 billion to be able to rebuild Ukraine, taking into account what we know with an ongoing war, as you say, that is going to last longer. 400 billion euros. The Ukrainian government talks about 750 billion, and the European Reconstruction and Development Bank talks about even more. So that would be the GDP of Spain to rebuild Ukraine in 10 years once the plan is started. Getting the money is going to be possible, but difficult. We've talked about the fatigue of society and citizens of the EU and other Western countries, but at the end of the day, we see a mobilization of funds coming from different sources and with many different mechanisms to be applied. Last year, we were in the conference in Lugano where this was discussed, but there have been other conferences. And in July this year in London, there was a big conference on the reconstruction of Ukraine, where we had also the participation of the private sector, because the investments of the private sector are going to be fundamental. Also contributions from the US and other countries, and the EU has talked about a mechanism of 50 billion euros to work on the reconstruction of Ukraine, both on the reconstruction of those facilities and infrastructures, as well as in the accompaniment for the process of becoming a European member state, because reconstruction goes beyond physical reconstruction. There's also a discussion that started at the beginning of the war, a very interesting discussion that is important for both economists and lawyers, and that is how to use the Russian funds in the territory, because there is a paradox that a country that attacks, and we know that is criticizing and showing their hate towards the West, and the EU specifically had many assets in European territory.
It's been calculated that there are 200 billion euros of frozen assets in the EU. There may be a further 100 billion in other tax havens in the US and other places. So right from the outset, there's been a series of experts who have said that these frozen funds should be used to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine. This theoretically and from a civilian viewpoint seems to make sense, but of course you have to question who owns these things. But that's the trend. And recently, 3 US eminent economists actually supported this idea in several fora about how the legal obstacles could be overcome to use this money. And then there's the challenge of all the different formula that are used, which is that so that Ukrainian debt doesn't increase exponentially, so that doesn't become another millstone for the building, the reconstruction of Ukraine, so that it doesn't become a millstone that lasts for generations and generations via subsidies and other mechanisms, so that that doesn't happen. How can that be done? Some things have already been done. All the EU and other countries support, and it may seem kind of basic what I'm saying, but when energy infrastructures were attacked, the EU started sending out generators so that people can get electricity back. They've also sent out sufficient equipment so that Ukrainian engineers can reestablish as quickly as possible the electricity supply whenever there's destruction of energy sources. Tools and material are being sent to build mobile bridges. You can't normally rebuild a large bridge that has been destroyed, but you can at least offer something that returns the people who are living in these terrible situations into a situation which is more normal. There's also the challenge of creating institutions in a reconstruction stage. There are examples that have been taken, for example, from natural disasters. For example, the agency that was set up in Indonesia after the tsunami, in Queensland more recently, and also in Puerto Rico. There are agencies that coordinate these kind of activities, and what's being debated is a joint agency which would, of course, have the participation of the Ukrainian government. The European Commission is actually setting up an expert group that can work on this, but the institution hasn't actually been set up yet. Some kind of a reconstruction agency hasn't been created yet. The Ukrainian government opened an office, what they call the National Council for Reconstruction, and asked for suggestions from the citizens about where they wanted to rebuild their house. This is their country. This is still something that's pending, but it'll happen. There's something else that crops up time and time again, which is that one of the Ukrainian government's challenges is its fight against corruption. Any future agency, one of its remits must be to monitor funds. We're talking about a country that is going to receive billions of euros. And these billions of euros need to be spent on what they should be spent on in a country which has a history of corruption. With that, and with just a couple more of points, I want to finish. Evidently, what is being done and what the EU could carry on doing is to carry on supporting their accession plans. A few weeks ago, Ukraine had actually passed 2 of the 7 points of the 7-point plan, points related to the media and the judiciary. There's another point where they've made tremendous progress, which is also related to renewing judges at the Constitutional Court. There's still a lot to be done in the fight against corruption, the prevention of money laundering, the excess of oligarch influence in the Ukrainian economy, and protection of minorities. The Ukrainian government has said that it wants to have all the other remaining points ready by October. I don't know if this is feasible or not, but they've said they want to have them ready by October to start the formal accession talks. And then a couple of additional points that I want to mention when considering any reconstruction project in Ukraine. Let's not forget the gender perspective. Although it may well seem that, but Ukraine is in 64th in 156 countries of the gender divide, according to a study. And let's not forget mental health as well. That's something else. Any plan for the reconstruction of a country, we're talking here about a country that's has suffered a great deal of stress, not just those people that have been injured or that are going to require medical care, but rather a large swathe of the population. I should also like to highlight here minorities and the Russian-speaking populations, because the Russian-speaking populations are those that have had to leave places that have been occupied. Their original language is Russian, but they feel Ukrainian, and they are against what Russia is doing, and they are having problems to adapt and to integrate. I've seen this also in my work as the president of a board of the NGO that works a great deal in Ukraine, and this is one of the challenges that still remains. Thank you. Can I ask the chair, please, to allow me to say something? Because all the time the European Union should, I understand that, and the argument that we have to help Ukraine to wage war, but at the same time help it find peace is, of course, key. And I'm sorry if what people perceive, and it's not something that just you said, but the perception that people receive is that, okay, you only talk about one of these two things. Every time you open your mouth, it's to say you need to give them more weapons, we need to increase our military expenditure. You never talk about peace. You only talk about how to wage war. Well, actually, things aren't what they are, but they're rather the way they're perceived. Perception is not the same as reality. And I'm actually sorry that that is the perception, because I have the feeling that we're doing both. Maybe we're not doing things as well enough that they should be perceived in that way. We in the EU do support a path to peace, or to the end of hostilities, or you can call it whatever you want. And for us, this peace path is the plan that was presented by President Zelensky. We've seen that loud and clear. And we've been in Stockholm at the first conference that was called by Sweden. We also attended Jeddah, the conference. At the highest level. We're not at the highest level, but at certain levels, but that's because the conference wasn't called at the highest level. But I think for any observer who wants to know it, the European Union supports a peace plan, which is Zelensky's peace plan. There's no other one on the table, at least as far as I know. There is no other peace plan on the table, and we're not going to present a peace plan which is different to the Ukrainian one, because that would turn us into mediators. Nobody's asking for us to be mediators. The European Union will never mediate because it's not neutral. So how can it mediate? So finding ways of a process that puts an end to hostilities as early as possible. And this is something that you've all spoken. Some people have said that the war needs to go on for longer, others that it needs to be shortened. But there are some processes that can't be measured according to the time that they last, but rather the time that they last until the goal is obtained. How long something lasts doesn't tell me anything if you don't know what the end game is. It's how long it lasts until you get to the end game. Because otherwise, we've defined the problem wrongly. It's a long war in comparison to what? Or a short war in comparison to what? And I think that in the world, with the exception of Russia, I don't think there's anybody that's saying, I want a long war. What we do say is that the war can't end any old how. So it's not so much how long something lasts, whether it's going to last a week or a year. No, but the mathematical terms. It would be minimize the time that's necessary to achieve peace. That's what I want to do. Minimize the time that we want to reach the end game. But if you don't tell me what the end game is, I don't know if that's short, long, or medium. And it's important to be clear on that, because I may want a short war. I know a way of shortening this war. Well, there's two ways. Either Russia just leaves and withdraws, which it won't do, and the other is the allies, the Ukrainian allies, stop helping Ukraine. If we stop helping Ukraine tomorrow, they'd carry on struggling, they'd carry on fighting, but they wouldn't be able to for much long. You can't just carry on throwing stones against a tank. They'd be left with no ammunition, because what do Ukrainians want? We already know that. Ammunition. If they have no ammunition, how are they going to resist? So you want a short war? I'll tell you how it should be a short war. But how it ends, if you don't define the conditions of the end game, and I don't know how long the game's going to last for. If the conditions of the end game aren't important, then, the war can end really quickly. If they are important, and they are, then the war will last depending upon what the end game conditions are. And that's what I think we need to explain. And every time somebody says to me, I want the shortest war possible to achieve something, because if you don't know what you want to achieve, and it may well be that Russia wants the shortest war possible until it achieves its goals. Once it's achieved its goals, not before then. And probably Russia can resist a longer war because it's an authoritarian country, because they've got more soldiers, because they're not worried about public opinion or about their population, because Russians are historically population that you think you've beaten and they actually then overcome. For example, like against Napoleon and Hitler, they've got many things in their favor in Russia. And so we could think that a longer war would probably, they'd better resist a longer war. Let's ask for questions from the floor. If peace does inexorably go via territorial integrity of Ukraine and the complete withdrawal, therefore, of all Russian troops from Ukraine, are we doing everything necessary to achieve that peace? What I've said is that the best way of supporting peace today is by supporting Ukraine. That's our common denominator. But it's not always the logical basis that others start from. They could say, if you want peace, stop helping Ukraine. Those people that say we're prepared to fight until the final Ukrainian is standing, their magic form is to stop helping the Ukrainians. And so if we stop supporting Ukraine tomorrow, what do you think is going to happen? The Lithuanian overseas minister asked for a plan for victory. So there's a plan for victory. I'm not talking so much here about the European Union. We national governments in Western and Central Europe have actually done everything within our power for that victory to be possible, for that peace to be possible, which includes territorial integrity for Ukraine and the withdrawal of Russia. The thing is, no, not yet. That's why I think maybe there's people that don't have the ability to do everything within their power. The European Union doesn't have that, but national governments do. But national governments also have political restrictions. I don't think there's any intention. Nor do I want to think that. Well, no, there's no plot there. You said it clearly before. It may well seem that from a military viewpoint and with all the cynicism that when you're talking about human lives at stake, 40 billion euros for somebody to annihilate the conventional military power of Russia is a good investment. Could be a good investment if you look at it cold and if you're cold and calculating about that. How much are the 2,000 tanks that the Russian army's lost worth? But I don't think that somebody's actually calculating that to make the war go on and on and on. It's not so much that Ukraine wins, but that Russia loses. The winning of one side and the losing of the other side actually doesn't coincide. I have to take the floor to explain and reiterate something. When you talk about Ukraine's territorial integrity, it's not something they just talk about. That's why I was talking about the deportation of children, because nobody knows who that person in the photo is, do they? Well, she's the mayor of Motysin. She basically this is in the north of Kiev. This is one of the first towns taken by the Russian. And these are the remains of the mayor and her son. And also in Hostomel, the same thing happened. This logic comes from Stalinism. They conceive society as vertical. So what you do is you decapitate society. How do you get rid of civil society and any person that has any kind of own political thought? I talk quite a bit with war crimes researchers in Ukraine, and one thing that they talk about is that these kinds of practices that are happening in occupied areas are worsening, because in the past they were activists, local councillors that just disappeared, but now they send to detention centres. And Associated Press has published a report about detention centres, and Russia wants to build more of them. If you don't support Putin in social media, then you're just going to be sent to the detention centres. Some people have to go back to occupied areas because they can't be maintained in areas. So Russia's what Russia's doing is what's called the passportization process. Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of territorial integration. If things don't change, it's not going to be a viable country. It's like Spain losing its Atlantic area, Galicia, Asturias, and Cantabria, and you get the rest of it. And if Ukraine depends on exports, it depends on its agriculture in the south. If you move that, then the country is less viable. It has more dependency on us, so it has a poorer future. And I'm talking about the rear guard, but Russians are bombing not only the populations in the front, but the neighboring populations. Nobody's heard of Chasilia and Kramatorsk, because they're going to bomb Kramatorsk more and more. It's not something that the Ukrainians it's not a fancy of flight from the Ukrainians. They've got to get rid of the Russians, otherwise they're just bombing things. People don't see this, but everybody, every day, somebody dies in Ukraine because of Russian artillery fire. The thing is, there is no future for Ukraine in its current situation. That's why Ukraine has to carry on fighting. I'm hoping I never said this was a flight of fancy. I'm under no circumstance. We all know that Russia takes no notice just of international law. What I'm saying is that Russia knows that using conventional forces it won't get military victory, but it may well be that it also knows that it won't be defeated using traditional methods, at least in the current circumstances or in the current balance of powers. Either the current balance of powers change or Russia carries on until it gets the fatigue of the Western suppliers of weapons or similar, or the pressure of the citizenry or whatever. That's the scenario we need to think about. I understand that what your criticism is, that what you're asking is, why aren't you helping Ukraine more? Why aren't you helping Ukraine more? What you're saying is, if you're helping Ukraine, help Ukraine as much as is necessary. You think things have gone too slowly. We've managed, we start training pilot, and this starts to use, and I think it's a reasonable criticism. But stop helping and then the war will end is not a reasoned criticism. It doesn't have. The thing is, what you're saying is more. You're saying that you've got to help Ukraine more, and you actually agree on that. Because what you're saying is you need long-range missiles to really hit those places where Russia is sending its bombs from. Because they bomb from such a long way away that we can only prevent them landing on our territory by catching them when they're in flight. Even via the press, how can we interpret what the U.S. press is saying these last few days, saying that Ukrainians don't want their people to die, they're not doing sufficient for the offensive to advance, when I know that a machined unit needs the support of direct fire and needs air support for the land unit so that it can progress. So if I'm saying, come on, let attack, but I'm not giving them the means that I have that I could give them, why should I criticize them? Christina, do you want to say anything? I don't want to get involved in the defense debate, but I share this idea of supporting, but I insist this other support, which is to carry on working with public opinion in the EU, and that this support go a lot further, for example, in accession, which is a very complicated political issue. We know that it's not just a matter of accession. There's this debate surrounding who yes, who no. Tomorrow you'll be talking about the Balkans, but I think in the end, this is something that's cropped up on several occasions today. What does victory mean for the EU? If we don't receive Ukraine and defend their values, then we'll all have lost, because otherwise you get the victory of Russia that doesn't believe in this system, doesn't believe in defending values or international law. So when we talk about accession, this debate about accession, it's a very complicated debate, especially in some societies, and we also need to talk to that with other states that are knocking on our doors. So they need a response. And I always compare with the reunification of Germany. That was a huge bet. the European Union wasn't there at the time, but I think we need to gamble, make this kind of gamble. I should also like to emphasize that supporting Ukraine isn't quality, it's something in the interest of European security. People talk about historical comparisons, and people who say this looks more like 1938, people talk about at the end of the First World War. No, this looks more like the German invasion of Sudetenland, and you can compare that. So it's not a question of charity. There will be no peace in Europe if Russia wins. There is no precedent of this ideology. If it wins, then stopping there. Lessons. What about lessons learned? We talk about lessons learned. If we look back a few years ago, it may well be that circumstances will be different. Russia doesn't care about NATO. What it wants is for Ukraine not to be protected. And then another couple of things. The Ukrainians are leagues ahead of us in this debate in some things. And they're, of course, thinking about what's going to happen. And you compare with South Korea, and maybe we're going to have circumstances in which we're not going to be able to reach our goals today. But basically, when people talk about Crimea, Ukraine bombs from Crimea. The first thing that they want to do in Crimea is to demilitarize Crimea. And I think this is really important to understand. The Ukrainians are thinking about that. They're thinking about their peace formula. And their peace formula reminds us about territorial integrity of countries and the UN Charter. If we don't respect the UN Charter, then put an end to this, because there is no international order. You can go to the beach. I understand that we've overstepped time, and we really are. You're only here for the fun of it now.
Vamos a pasar a las preguntas.
Podemos coger preguntas, pero a mí la cifra que has dado de reconstrucción.
We can take questions, but the figures you gave for reconstruction, I think, is quite low. But why talk about reconstruction when destruction continues? The first thing we have to do is to stop destruction. Well, we have to work simultaneously. First of all, because we need to bring back a degree of normality to the population, no doubt. But to maintain the way in which they see things. So when we send generators, because during the winter they didn't have electricity, and he would say, thanks for the electric generator, but send me anti-air defense, because if not, tomorrow it will be destroyed. You can send as many as you want, but they will be destroyed tomorrow. But don't forget to give me the way to defend it. And we also need to have historic memory. What is would be the Marshall Plan today that has been studied as the mythical example of reconstruction? That would be 300 billion. If someone wants to spend what the U.S. spent in the reconstruction of Europe, it would be 300 billion euros. And then we have the whole human dimension. Right now in Ukraine, there's between 3 and 5 million children that cannot go to school. So the figures are impacting, or they are shocking. We can continue speaking, but I believe we're at the end, and we have to give the floor to the suffering attendees of this course. Hello, and very quickly, I'm Luque Uribe Echevarria, senator of the Basque Nationalist Party. In a situation of negotiation for peace, would it really be necessary to have a mediator if the EU is not able to mediate? And I agree with what you said, Giuseppe. Who would be the mediator? China presented a proposal that was not taken into account because it has an interest. It's an interested party. I also believe that the aim of Russia is to destroy morally and materially Ukraine. We see it's an unequal war also because of the fact that Ukraine, and saying this in a very direct manner, cannot attack Russian territory. And from there onwards, to try whatnot an awareness raising process of Russian civil society regarding its authorities. If you don't do so, and if we look at what has happened, and we see this in the media, it's because we would lose the reasons for which we are helping Ukraine before this absolutely horrible invasion of Russia. Thank you. I am Hector Rodriguez. I have a degree in political sciences of law of the Autonomous University in Madrid. And my question has to do with the sphere of international law and public international law. And it is for any of the speakers. When we talk about a humanitarian law, for anyone that's a skeptic that sees that we're breaking the Geneva Conventions and others, how can you continue defending the effectiveness and even validity of this kind of regime in the public international law? Thank you.
Hola de nuevo.
Hello again, I'm Carlos Navalon from Foreign Affairs of the Government of Andalusia. I asked this a question before, but I have more questions for you. This is a very quick question. Isn't there a possibility of, or couldn't an way of stopping this war would be in Russia? I lived in Russia for 5 months in Moscow, and I had the maybe erroneous perception that the citizens are very loyal to the state. They feel a threat from abroad, taking into account that it is a country with many borders, and they are very loyal to their state. But in any case, don't you believe, like in the 20th century, with all the wars that which Russia has lost, this has had an effect in Russia itself? For example, with Russian-Japanese in 1917, and also in the Afghanistan war, there was also a strong internal pressure. Couldn't that be the end of the war, and that is for Russian citizens themselves to stop and to end this war? Thank you.
Mi nombre es Ángel Soria, soy economista.
Hello, I'm Marcos Soria. I'm an economist, and I believe that the supply of military material is as important as the training of soldiers, as well as damaging financially the enemy. In this case, Russia is an export of raw materials. The exports from Russia to India have gone from a 1% to a 40%. And many of them have to go to refineries in India and then are exported to Europe. The same thing is happening with other countries. In the case of Spain, in the last 2 years, we've gone from a 9% dependence to a 29% dependence of Russian gas. Couldn't this be stopped? That's my question.
Sí, me llamo
Hello, I'm Carmelo Barrio, and I'm a Basque parliamentary from the Popular Party. And I've been talking to Giuseppe about this, but I would like to know, what is the role of Wagner? Is he an actor of the war? He's a warlord. And Jesus, this question is for you because as an expert, I would like to know what your view is on Wagner as a group, as a warlord, or what is his position, the role. And I would like to know what your analysis of the evolution. We've seen very weird things. His military activity as well as the criminal ones, the criminal policies with the Kremlin. So I would like to see what analysts believe is going to be the evolution of this actor in the Ukrainian war. Regarding public international law, not at all. I was trained in that in Bilbao, a city that competes with Santander as an also beautiful city. And in fact, it's just the opposite. In situations like this, we have to see what's the importance of humanitarian international law. One of the reasons why Putin cannot go to South Africa is because he has an arrest order because of deporting children. When the international court does this, you have lots of evidence. And secondly, and I go back to the text itself, the ongoing act is so severe that this has to be put in place. That's why we talk also about a special court, but anything we can do to reinforce international mechanisms, specifically now, is necessary for our future and the future of our children, because the alternative is what I've shown you. And very briefly, regarding Russia. People talk about a revolution, but many of the Russians voted when there was a mobilization dictated. I had friends in St. Petersburg, and I've lost contact with them. They're probably in Israel or somewhere. So this myth of the internal fight, what amongst other things is doing, Putin, is to get rid of prisoners. How many have died in Bakhmut? 9,000. To clean the prisons, which is Soviet practice, and minorities. So the Russians themselves are being protected, let's say, at least some populations are. I believe that we will continue to find difficulties when we see this as a problem only for Putin. This girl was killed in the Chernihiv bombing 2 or 3 days ago. She's a part of the long list of children that have died in bombings. Last night, I was in one of the Telegram channels from Russia, and there was almost 100,000 likes to a picture of the girl saying, I'm selling unused children's shoes. So listening to the Ukrainians and the population is very important, because Putin is not on his own. If not, the war wouldn't be reaching these levels. And people that know Russia much better than myself say that there's a long-lasting work being done. And one thing more for my colleagues from the Basque Country, when we talk about mediation, when we talk about China, the concept is a facilitator with direct messages and so on and so forth. Maybe China could have this role because of their access to China, so not to escalate at a nuclear level. But I have my doubts regarding China. Other candidates like Turkey and so on, I don't know. I will leave it there. Just a couple of comments regarding what has been said. I agree with you, Borja. I don't believe we're able to know what Russian society knows, even less from Moscow. That is somehow isolated. All the studies from the Levada Center, which is our only reference, provides supporting more than an 80%, even after Wagner. So we cannot believe that there's going to be this internal revolution if we continue with this dynamic. And the roots of nationalism created by Putin are so present, and he's brought back a part of the pride to Russians, because let's not forget they've been an empire, and that feeling of being an empire is something very difficult to lose. That loss pride and that sense of humiliation is something that he's used. And there's also something that I like to talk about. We published an article of a Russian economist that did a balance of expenses and human lives, and his estimate was that Russia is going to lose 10% of its population of men between 20 and 29, which goes back to what this means regarding talent and age societies and so on and so forth. And to this, we need to add this million people, more or less, that has left the country. And one thing else I would like to say that could be discussed later on, of things that can be done by the EU, is the work with the Russian diaspora. On the one hand, because Ukraine and many activists and representatives make prevail the idea that they don't want to know anything about what is happening in Russia, but many of the opposition Russian media, as well as the diaspora with all the risks involved, are talking, and this is something that we should also focus on. And one more thing regarding mediators, it is very difficult. One thing is to facilitate, and another different thing is to mediate. I would like to talk about the example of Brazil. Brazil doesn't have a peace plan. They've said that they want to participate in a peace initiative without really having a real proposal of how to do so. And very sorry, but I have a train and I have to leave. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Como había una pregunta directa.
There was a direct question for me, in fact, so I will answer that. Humanitarian international law is present each and every day. UN is criticized because it doesn't comply with the function it was created for. So who is going to facilitate and mediating in the fact that we don't say the UN shows what is happening? What is the plan? With all the limitations of the imperfect filters, Colin Powell had to say, well, you have to believe me, believe that there is mass destruction of weapons, because he needs to explain himself, to explain what the U.S. is going to do. If we didn't have this imperfect mechanism, then we just have the law of who's stronger. Regarding convincing the Russian society, there's no survey that is trustworthy. But let's look at a couple of things. On the one hand, Putin is a synonym of recovery of the pride as Russians and a better situation for Russians. Because when Putin starts to be in power in 1999, they were in a very bad situation, and since then he's cut off all the opposition, the media against him, and organized society. You have to be very courageous to be out on the streets, because you're going to be sent directly to the front probably. So supposing that this is the mechanism through which Russia is going to change position is very, I would say, wishful thinking. And Wagner is a business at the end of the day that, amongst other things, is organizing armed attacks, and therefore is an instrument used by Putin. But we have, of course, a Russian nationalist that is close to Putin throughout his career, and they each make use of this, of each other and of this mechanism. A mechanism that wasn't in the front line. It had done what it had to do to control Bakhmut. It's not embedded in combat, and at that point, with 300 or 500 fighters go towards Moscow, and there's no military resistance to allow them to progress. But in any case, if people fall through windows and so on and so forth, if Wagner hasn't been eliminated yet, it's because he's necessary. Maybe he's not necessary in Africa, but he will be necessary for future tests. Therefore, Wagner continues to be an instrument, and Wagner is just one of the groups like this in Russia, because there are more other groups that compete with Wagner. Therefore, I guess there will be fights against them too. So having a private armed force is a way of doing things in the different ways, and for them to do things that cannot be done by the regular military. Well, I think after this we deserve to rest. I would like to thank the speakers, and thank you all for your attention.